In the grim darkness of the far future, there are few absolutes. Empires rise and crumble across the span of millennia. Heroes become legends, then myths, then dust scattered across forgotten battlefields. But some things endure. Some warriors refuse to die, even when death would be a mercy. And some greenskin Xenos never learn when to leave well enough alone. This is a story about what happens when unstoppable Ork ingenuity meets the immovable resolve of a Minotaur's space marine entombed within his walking tomb, all set against the nightmare backdrop of a world where reality itself has surrendered to the dark gods of chaos. It is a tale of three forces colliding in the most hostile environment imaginable, where the very ground beneath your feet might suddenly decide it prefers being the sky, and where the air tastes of copper and screams. The planet in question has no name worth remembering. It once had a designation, a string of numbers and letters in some administratum catalogue, but those records burned when the warp storms came. Now it exists in that twilight realm between the material universe and the immaterium, a place where the laws of physics are more like polite suggestions that reality feels free to ignore whenever the mood strikes. The sky cycles through colors that should not exist, shades that hurt to look at and linger in the mind long after you close your eyes. The landscape is a fever dream made solid, all wrong angles and impossible geometries that seem to shift when you are not looking directly at them. Mountains rise and fall like the breath of sleeping gods. Rivers flow uphill before remembering which way water is supposed to go. The ruins of what might once have been cities dot the horizon, their buildings twisted into shapes that make your eyes water and your brain itch. This is a demon world, a place so saturated with the power of chaos that the barrier between the real and the unreal has worn tissue thin. Demons manifest here with disturbing ease, their forms more stable and enduring than they could ever be in the Imperium proper. The air itself seems alive with malevolence, pressing against any souls bold or foolish enough to set foot upon this cursed soil. Into this nightmare came the Orks, because of course they did. Where saner species would look at such a world and decide that perhaps their time would be better spent literally anywhere else, the greenskins see only opportunity. A world twisted by chaos means potential loot. Strange energies means potential power. Demons means potential fights, and fights, loot, and power are the holy trinity of Ork existence. The war band that made planetfall numbered somewhere between 200 and 300 strong, though exact counts are difficult with Orks. They breed and fight and die with such enthusiasm that their numbers fluctuate daily. They were led by a particularly cunning war boss named Gragmek Skull Stomper, a massive specimen who stood nearly 12 feet tall, even when slouching, which was most of the time. His head was a collection of scars and crude bionics, the result of countless battles, and his unfortunate tendency to test the stopping power of enemy weapons with his face. That he still had most of his teeth was a testament to either his toughness or his luck, probably both. Gragmek's warband was a motley collection of Ork clans, though the Death Skulls contingent was particularly strong. Those blue-painted looters had sniffed out something valuable on this world through whatever sixth sense drives their obsessive scavenging. Their mech boys had detected power signatures, the kind that suggested Imperial technology, which meant good salvage if they could get their hands on it. The fact that the planet was actively trying to kill them was merely an added bonus, spicing up what might otherwise have been a boring salvage operation. They spread out across the twisted landscape, their trucks and battle wagons bouncing over terrain that seemed to actively resent their presence. More than one vehicle disappeared into sudden sinkholes that definitely had not been there a moment before. Several boys vanished when they got too close to crystalline formations that might have been rock or might have been frozen screams given physical form. One particularly unfortunate grot was snatched up by something that looked like a tree but moved like it was having a seizure, pulled into its branches, and was never seen again, though his screaming could be heard for hours afterward, coming from every direction at once. The Orks barely noticed these losses. This was, by their standards, a pretty normal day. They pushed deeper into the corrupted wilderness, following the power readings that their mechs insisted came from somewhere in the blasted wasteland ahead. The trail led them through forests where the trees had too many branches and not enough leaves, across plains where the grass grew in geometric patterns that hurt to look at, and finally to a valley that seemed to have been carved by some titanic claw. And there, half buried in the corrupted earth, covered in centuries of accumulated filth, and wrapped in the dying vines of vegetation that should not exist, they found it. The Dreadnought. It sat at an angle, one leg buried deeper than the other, giving it a slight tilt that made it look like a giant warrior caught mid-stride. The bronze and brass coloring of its armor was dulled by time and exposure, but here and there, the original finish showed through, gleaming with a luster that spoke of superior metallurgy and sacred oils applied by hands that knew their craft. The left arm ended in a massive power fist, fingers frozen in a grip that had probably been crushing something when this machine last moved. The right arm mounted a multi-melter, its barrels dark and cold, but still radiating a sense of barely contained destructive potential. Most distinctive was the sarcophagus at the machine's heart, the armored shell that housed the Dreadnought's pilot. It was decorated with icons and purity seals that had somehow survived the corrupting influence of the daemon world, their presence seeming to create a small bubble of sanity in the madness around them. A bull's head in bronze, horns pointing forward in eternal challenge, marked this as a warrior of the Minotaurs chapter, those brutal and mysterious sons of the Imperium who served the High Lords of Terror with unwavering, merciless efficiency. The Orks stood in silence for perhaps 3 seconds, which might be a record for their species. Then, the shouting began. "Dibs!" screamed a Death Skull looter, already sprinting forward. "Nah, I saw it first!" bellowed another, close behind. "Get out of my way, ya gits!" roared a big mech, shoving smaller Orks aside as he charged toward the prize. Within moments, the valley had erupted into exactly the kind of controlled chaos that Orks call organization. Mech boys swarmed over the Dreadnought like ants on a corpse, their crude tools scraping against ceramite as they tried to figure out which bits were loot and which bits were holding the whole thing together. Several fights broke out immediately when multiple Orks claimed the same component. Blood flowed green and red where chaos-mutated vegetation had taken root, and the air filled with the sounds of Orkish argument, which is to say, a lot of shouting punctuated by occasional violence. Gragmek watched from a distance, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He was smarter than the average Ork, which was less of an achievement than one might hope, but still useful for a war boss. Something about this felt wrong. The Dreadnought was intact mostly. Its power systems were clearly functional, or the mechs would not have detected it. So why was it just sitting here? Why had it not walked off this miserable world? Why had it not been claimed by whatever chaos forces controlled this realm? "Boss," said his second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Rukbad. "The mechs say it's one of them space marine things, a Dreadnought or something." "I got eyes, you git," Gragmek rumbled. "Question is, why is it just sitting here? Maybe it's broke. Maybe it ain't." That thought had apparently not occurred to Rukbad, whose face went through several expressions before settling on concern. "You think there's still a beaky inside?" Only one way to find out. Before Gragmek could give the order to approach with caution, which would have been ignored anyway, one of the mech boys did something incredibly stupid. He managed to access an external power port and ran a current through it, trying to jumpstart the ancient machine systems. It was the kind of crude, straightforward thinking that perfectly encapsulated the Orkish approach to technology. It would either work, or it would not. And if it did not, well, that mech had gotten a good fight in before joining the great scrap pile in the sky. For several seconds, nothing happened. The Dreadnought remained as still and silent as it had been for who knows how many years. The mech was just about to pronounce it properly dead when the machine's optical sensors suddenly blazed to life, filling the valley with twin beams of searchlight brilliance that cut through the perpetual gloom of the demon world like judgment itself. Every orc in the valley froze. Even by their standards, they recognized that they might have made what could be called a mistake if orcs acknowledged the existence of such things, which they generally do not. Deep within the sarcophagus, suspended in amniotic fluid that had kept him alive for longer than some imperial worlds had existed, the warrior within woke to consciousness. It came slowly at first, like surfacing from deep water, awareness filtering back in layers. Sound first, the scrape of metal on metal, guttural voices speaking a language he recognized as Orcish, though he could not understand the specific words. The sensation of pressure, systems coming online, power flowing through connections that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to move. His name was Hecaton Timon, though it had been so long since anyone had spoken it that even he sometimes forgot. Once, he had been a warrior of the Minotaurs chapter, a veteran sergeant who had led his brothers through 18 major campaigns and countless minor engagements. His record had been exemplary, his loyalty unquestioned, his effectiveness in battle legendary among his peers. Then came the siege of Kefren Prime, where he had held a choke point against a heretic Astartes warband for 6 hours after his brothers had fallen, his body shredded by bolt rounds and melter fire, his armor fused to his flesh by the heat of plasma weapons. They had found him in the ruins, more dead than alive, his gene seed somehow intact, his brain still sparking with neural activity. The apothecaries said he would not survive. The chaplain said his spirit burned too bright to let it fade. The tech marines said they could rebuild him. And so they had, placing what remained of his body into the sarcophagus of a Contemptor pattern Dreadnought and binding his consciousness to the machine. That had been during the Kefren campaign, which by his calculations was roughly 370 standard years ago. Since then, Hecaton had been awakened 27 times, always for the most brutal conflicts, always for battles where the Minotaurs needed his particular combination of ancient experience and overwhelming firepower. Between deployments, he slept in the deep halls of the chapter's fortress monastery, a dreamless sleep that passed like the blink of an eye. Or at least it should have. The last thing he remembered was deployment to a contested demon world on the edges of the Hadex anomaly. There had been a massive battle, chaos forces in numbers that blotted out the horizon, his brothers fighting beside him, as they always did. Then something had gone wrong. A trap, he thought, though the memories were hazy. An explosion, the ground opening beneath him, falling through layers of reality that should not exist. Then nothing but silence and darkness, and the slow, patient wait for an awakening that he had begun to think would never come. And now he was awake, his systems reporting damage but overall functionality, his weapons showing adequate charge, his senses painting a picture of the world around him that made his ancient warrior's heart sink with grim understanding. He was still on a demon world. He could feel the corruption pressing against his armored shell, sense the wrongness of this place trying to seep through every seal and joint. His chronometer said he had been inactive for 382 standard years. Though on a demon world, time was more of a polite fiction than an actual measurement. 3 centuries. 382 years of lying dormant while the warp tried to corrode his sanctified systems. And now, adding insult to considerable injury, there were orcs crawling all over him like particularly stupid flies on a corpse that had not yet realized it was dead. Hecaton's first action upon regaining full consciousness was to access his vocabulator and produce what might charitably be called communication. What came out was a war horn bellow amplified by speakers that had not been used in centuries. A sound like brazen thunder that echoed across the valley and probably several neighboring dimensions as well. "Desist your trespass, Xenos filth." The orcs, to their credit, did not immediately run away. This was partly because orcs do not really do running away, and partly because many of them were so surprised by the sudden noise that their brains had not yet caught up with events. Several of the mechs who had been directly on the Dreadnought found themselves suddenly airborne as Hecaton engaged his servo motors and began the process of standing up, 382 years of accumulated debris falling from his armor like snow. "O Zog," said Rukbad eloquently. "Weapons free," Hecaton announced, more to himself than to the Orks, following the combat protocols that had been drilled into him when he was still flesh and blood. Engaging hostile Xenos forces. The multi-melter on his right arm began to glow, heat building in its core, as ancient reactors spun up to combat power. The power fist on his left crackled with disruptive energy, ready to crush whatever had the misfortune to come within arm's reach. And Hecaton took his first step in nearly 4 centuries, a thunderous impact that shook the ground and sent several Orks tumbling. "Get him!" Gragmek bellowed, because while he might be smarter than average for an Ork, he was still an Ork, and run away simply was not in his vocabulary. The valley erupted into violence. Orks, being Orks, charged forward with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for free food and surprise parties, their crude weapons barking out streams of dakka that spanged harmlessly off Hecaton's armor. The Dreadnought's return fire was significantly more effective. The multi-melter spoke once, a lance of superheated energy that reduced 3 Orks to their constituent atoms and melted a 4th one's shooter into slag that fused with his hand. He spent several seconds staring at the molten mess before someone pushed him over, and he was trampled by his fellows. Hecaton advanced with the inexorable gait of an avalanche given purpose. Each step was calculated, each movement economical. He had fought for the Minotaurs for 382 years before his internment, and had continued that service for 370 more. He knew battle like other beings knew breathing. The Orks came at him in a green tide, and he met them with precisely applied violence, the power fist crushing bodies with wet, meaty sounds, while the multi-melter carved burning lines through their numbers. But this was a demon world, and on demon worlds, nothing is ever as simple as it should be. The very air seemed to thicken around the battle, reality becoming sluggish and uncertain. Hecaton's targeting systems began reporting strange readings, sensor ghosts that appeared and disappeared, temperature fluctuations that made no sense, gravity acting in ways that would have made a tech priest weep. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, sometimes solid rock and sometimes disturbingly soft, like flesh. And beyond the Orks, he could sense something else watching, something that found this conflict amusing or intriguing, or perhaps just novel enough to warrant attention. The demons had noticed. Of course they had. A loyal servant of the Emperor, a holy warrior encased in sanctified metal, was fighting on what they considered their turf. They would not be able to resist interfering. It was in their nature. But that was a problem for future Hecaton. Present Hecaton had approximately 200 Orks trying to kill him, loot him, or possibly both in no particular order, and that required his full attention. The Minotaurs chapter is not well understood by most of the Imperium. Their history is deliberately obscured, sealed behind authority codes that even high-ranking inquisitors struggle to access. What is known paints a picture of a chapter that is brutal, efficient, and utterly loyal to the High Lords of Terror in ways that bypass the normal chain of command. They are the blunt instrument that the Senatorum Imperialis uses when other Space Marines might ask inconvenient questions or harbor inconvenient loyalties to their fellow Astartes. The chapter bears the colors of bronze and brass, their armor gleaming like ancient statues come to life. Their heraldry features the bull's head, horns forward, a symbol that harkens back to ancient Terran mythology from the age before the Emperor unified humanity's birthworld. Everything about them speaks to a martial culture that values strength, directness, and absolute commitment to their assigned tasks. They do not do subtlety. They do not do mercy. They are hammers, pure and simple, and every problem looks like a nail. What makes them particularly distinctive among the Adeptus Astartes is their apparent lack of concern for the traditions and bonds that typically unite Space Marine chapters. The Minotaurs have, on multiple recorded occasions, been deployed against other Space Marines. During the Badab War, they fought with such viciousness against fellow Loyalist chapters that their actions bordered on the excessive even by Space Marine standards. They forced the Lamenters to surrender after a 17-hour battle that left both chapters bloodied, and they did so without apparent hesitation or remorse. Their relationship with their dreadnoughts is particularly unusual. Where most chapters revere these ancient warriors as venerable forebears and living links to their history, the Minotaurs treat their entombed brothers with what can only be described as cold indifference. They address them by the title Hecaton, an ancient Terran word meaning either giant, legion, or monster, enslaved, depending on the translation. The multiple meanings are probably not coincidental. These dreadnoughts are weapons first, warriors second, and only distantly third are they considered brothers. The Minotaurs possess an unusual number of Contemptor pattern dreadnoughts, those ancient and powerful variants from the Great Crusade era that are rare treasures in most chapters. The fact that they can field at least 10 of these machines, and likely more, speaks to either incredible good fortune in salvage operations, or, more likely, to backing from sources with access to technology that should not exist in such quantities. The chapter's rumored ties to the High Lords of Terror take on additional sinister implications when one considers the resources they seem to possess. Their combat doctrine emphasizes siegecraft and attrition warfare, grinding down opponents through relentless pressure and overwhelming firepower. They excel at boarding actions and close-quarters battle, specialties of the Imperial Fist's gene line, though their exact genetic heritage remains classified. Some scholars suggest they may be chimeric, bearing gene seed from multiple sources, which would explain both their classified nature and their particular effectiveness. Others whisper darker theories about genetic engineering and mind-wiping, about warriors whose very personalities are artificially constructed and reinforced through hypno-indoctrination that borders on the heretical. What is certain is that the Minotaurs are superbly equipped. Their armory includes Mark VIII power armor in large quantities, extensive stocks of Terminator plate, including rare patterns, squadrons of Storm Eagle gunships, Spartan assault tanks, and war gear that would make other chapters weep with envy. Much of this equipment bears the heraldry of other chapters, trophies taken from those they have defeated. The Minotaurs are not just warriors. They are collectors, scavengers who build their strength on the graves of other Space Marines. Their chapter master, Asterion Moloch, embodies all of these qualities and more. He is brutal, paranoid, heavily cybernetically augmented, and utterly dedicated to the chapter's mission. Whether he is one man who has lived for centuries through extensive reconstruction, or a title passed down through artificially created successors, is a matter of speculation. What is not speculation is his effectiveness. Under his command, the Minotaurs have become one of the most feared loyalist chapters in the Imperium, regarded with suspicion by their fellow Astartes, and with satisfaction by the High Lords who employ them. For a warrior of the Minotaurs like Hecaton, these traditions and characteristics were not abstract concepts, but the very foundation of his existence. He had been trained, even before his interment, to be a weapon for the Imperium, to follow orders without question, to fight without mercy, to succeed without regard for cost. The Minotaurs did not make war. They executed it, cleanly and efficiently, like surgeons removing a cancer. Being entombed in a dreadnought had not changed these core aspects of his character. If anything, it had refined them, stripped away the last vestiges of doubt or hesitation that might trouble a warrior of flesh and blood. He was a weapon now, pure and simple. His body was armor and guns. His purpose was destruction. His duty was obedience. Everything else was irrelevant. But 382 years is a long time to be alone with your thoughts in the darkness, even for a space marine whose emotional range has been surgically modified and whose mind has been indoctrinated beyond the capacity of normal humans to endure. In that long silence, in those stretched out centuries of waiting, things had stirred in Hecaton's consciousness. Not doubts, precisely. The Minotaurs did not do doubts, but questions, observations, a slow, patient examination of his existence that he could not quite suppress, no matter how many battle-cant mantras he recited in the privacy of his own skull. He had wondered in those quiet moments what it meant to be a weapon that could think, to be a tool that could question, even if only internally, the hand that wielded it. The Minotaurs treated their dreadnoughts with indifference, and he had accepted this as proper. But acceptance did not erase the knowledge that once, before his internment, his brothers had fought beside him as equals, had shared rations after battle, had spoken his name with respect rather than simply viewing him as a particularly mobile piece of artillery. These thoughts, heretical as they might be by Minotaur's standards, had been easy enough to suppress when he was deployed in battle, when the immediate demands of combat filled his awareness and left no room for philosophical musings. But 382 years of silence had given them time to grow, to put down roots in the substrate of his consciousness like the chaos-twisted vegetation outside, putting roots into corrupted soil. Now, fighting for his survival against a horde of orcs on a demon world, while corruption pressed against his armor and his weapons systems, reported steadily declining ammunition reserves, Hecaton found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. He was alone, truly alone. His chapter either thought him destroyed, or more likely, had simply written him off as an acceptable loss centuries ago. There would be no rescue, no extraction, no brothers coming to his aid. There was only himself, the Orks, and the malevolent attention of chaos itself. And somehow, in a way that would have troubled him if he allowed himself to feel such things, that clarity was almost refreshing. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his duty was not defined by the orders of Chapter Master Moloch or the High Lords of Terror. His purpose was not execution of strategic objectives or the grinding down of enemies of the Imperium. His mission was simpler, more primal, more honest than anything he had done in centuries. Survive, endure, fight until there was nothing left to fight with. And if this was to be his end, then he would make it an end worthy of remembering, even if there was no one left to remember it, but himself, and whatever demons watched from beyond the veil. The multi-melter spoke again, and another cluster of orcs ceased to exist in a flash of superheated plasma. Hecaton advanced another step, crushing a grot beneath his foot without even noticing, his optical sensors tracking targets with the kind of cold efficiency that came from centuries of practice. The power fist lashed out, caught an orc that had gotten too close, and reduced it to a smear on the corrupted ground. Behind him, his ammunition counter continued its steady countdown towards 0. Before him, the orcs kept coming, because that was what orcs did. And above, the sky of the demon world cycled through colors that should not exist, as the powers of chaos leaned forward in their immaterial thrones to watch what happened next. Understanding a dreadnought requires understanding something fundamental about the nature of Space Marine culture and the grim pragmatism that underlies everything the Adeptus Astartes do. When a Space Marine suffers wounds that would kill even his enhanced physiology, when his body is so damaged that even the extensive regenerative capabilities granted by his gene seed cannot restore him to combat effectiveness, the chapter faces a choice. They can let their brother die, losing all the training, experience, and gene seed that went into creating him. Or they can preserve him, after a fashion, transforming him into something that is part warrior, part weapon, and part walking tomb. The process of creating a dreadnought is neither quick nor pleasant, though pleasant is perhaps not a word that applies to much in the grim darkness of the far future. The dying Space Marine is stabilized as much as possible, kept alive through a combination of medical technology and faith in the Emperor. His ruined body is encased in a cybernetic sarcophagus, a heavily armored shell that serves as both life support system and neural interface. This sarcophagus is then integrated into the Dreadnought chassis itself, becoming the machine's central processing unit, its source of consciousness and will. Within the sarcophagus, the Space Marine floats in amniotic fluid, a thick, cold substance that sustains his remaining biological functions. His arms and legs, if they still exist, are useless, vestigial things. His eyes are replaced by optical sensors that feed information directly into his brain through neural plugs. He breathes the amniotic fluid, his lungs adapted through surgery to process it, an experience that many describe as perpetually drowning without ever dying. Neural interface cables connect his nervous system to the Dreadnought's sensors and weapons, creating a link so absolute that the machine becomes, in effect, his new body. The experience of being a Dreadnought is, by all accounts, profoundly isolating. The warrior is sealed away from the physical world, experiencing everything through mechanical filters and electronic sensors. Touch becomes pressure readings, sight becomes data streams, sound is processed through audio pickups that lack the nuance of biological ears. The sensation of breathing air, of feeling wind or rain, of experiencing temperature without it being reduced to numbers on a display, all of this is lost. What remains is consciousness trapped in adamantium and ceramite, a mind bound to a machine with no escape until death finally claims it. Most chapters treat their dreadnoughts with enormous reverence. These ancient warriors are living links to the chapter's history, their memories extending back centuries or even millennia. They are consulted on matters of strategy and tradition, their wisdom valued, their sacrifice honored. Between battles, they sleep in stasis, preserved in sacred halls where tech marines tend to their systems with the care one might give to holy relics. When they wake, it is for battles of great significance, where their experience and firepower can turn the tide of war. But this reverence comes at a cost for the Dreadnought himself. Each awakening is a fresh trauma, consciousness returning to find oneself still trapped in the same metal prison, still isolated from the brotherhood that once defined existence. The periods of sleep are not restful. They are voids, empty spaces in time where the warrior simply ceases to exist, awareness switching off like a light, and then, subjectively an instant later, switching back on. There are no dreams, no sense of time passing, just the sudden, jarring transition from sleep to wakefulness, often to find that decades or centuries have passed, that brothers you knew are long dead, that the world has changed in ways both subtle and profound. For the Dreadnought, memory becomes the enemy. With each awakening, with each deployment, the connection to his former life grows weaker. The faces of brothers blur and fade. The sound of his own voice, the flesh and blood voice he had before the sarcophagus, becomes impossible to recall. His name feels strange, disconnected, like it belongs to someone else. The human parts of his consciousness, the memories and emotions that made him more than just a weapon, slowly erode under the weight of mechanical existence. Some dreadnoughts embrace this erosion. They welcome the transformation into pure weapons, seeing it as the final sacrifice they can make for their chapter and the Emperor. They let go of their humanity gradually, trading memories for efficiency, emotions for effectiveness. These ancient warriors become nearly indistinguishable from the machines they inhabit. Their consciousness reduced to little more than targeting protocols and tactical calculations wrapped around a fading core of loyalty. Others fight it. They cling to their memories like drowning men cling to driftwood, struggling to remember what it felt like to be human, to be flesh and blood, to walk among their brothers as an equal rather than a revered but distant artifact. These warriors suffer more, perhaps, maintaining their connection to their lost humanity at the cost of constant psychological pain. But they also retain something that the others lose, a spark of individuality that makes them more than just weapons, more than just war machines that happen to contain the echo of a man. The physical reality of being a dreadnought is equally grim. The sarcophagus is not spacious. The space marine inside is curled in a fetal position, his body atrophied from disuse, his flesh pale and thin from centuries of floating in amniotic fluid. The neural interface cables that connect him to the machine are permanent fixtures, impossible to remove without killing him. His lungs are adapted to process the amniotic fluid, meaning he can never breathe air again. His eyes are gone, replaced by sensors that will never see natural light the way human eyes do. The sensation of controlling a dreadnought is difficult to convey to those who have never experienced it. The warrior's consciousness extends into the machine, his sense of his own body expanding to encompass tons of adamantium and ceramite. He feels impacts against his armor as pressure against his skin. He aims his weapons as naturally as he once aimed a bolter. He walks on legs of metal and piston, each step an act of will made manifest through servo motors and hydraulics. In a very real sense, the dreadnought becomes his body. His armored shell becomes his skin, his weapons become his arms. But it is not a perfect translation. There is always a sense of distance, a feeling of being slightly disconnected from the machine, even as consciousness drives it. Phantom sensations plague many dreadnoughts, feeling the arms and legs they no longer possess, sensing pain or touch in limbs that exist only in memory. The psychological term for this is phantom limb syndrome, and for a dreadnought, the phantom limbs are an entire human body. The weapon systems a dreadnought carries are typically devastating, designed to bring firepower far beyond what an individual space marine could wield. Multi-melters that can reduce battle tanks to molten slag. Assault cannons that fire hundreds of mass-reactive shells per minute. Missile launchers, lascannons, plasma cannons, all configured to let a single warrior project the destructive capacity of a small army. In close combat, power fists and siege claws make the dreadnought a nightmare at melee range, capable of crushing armor and pulverizing flesh with equal ease. But weapons require ammunition, and ammunition is finite. Power cells drain. Fuel reserves deplete. A dreadnought in extended combat will eventually exhaust its resources, its terrible weapons falling silent not from damage, but from simple lack of ammunition. And when that happens, when the guns go quiet, and the power fist no longer crackles with disruptive energy, what remains is a very large, very heavily armored machine with no way to fight back. The warrior inside can do nothing but wait, trapped in his metal shell, unable to even open the sarcophagus to face his enemies eye to eye one final time. The psychological impact of this situation, of knowing that your ability to fight is draining away with every shot fired, with every power cell consumed, cannot be overstated. A space marine in regular power armor can fight with knife and fist if need be. A dreadnought cannot. When its weapons are empty, it becomes a tomb in the most literal sense. A sealed box containing a consciousness that can perceive but cannot act, that can understand its fate but cannot prevent it. This is the reality that Hecaton faced as he fought the Orks in that cursed valley. His ammunition counter showed reserves declining with each blast of the multi-melter, each burst from his systems. The power fist's energy cells were more stable, designed for sustained use, but even they had limits. He was not fighting a battle he could win through superior firepower. He was fighting a delaying action against inevitable depletion, and every orc he killed brought him one step closer to the moment when his weapons would fall silent, and he would be left defenseless against whatever came next. Yet he fought on, because that was what Space Marines did. That was what warriors of the Minotaurs did. That was what dreadnoughts did. Fight until fighting was no longer possible, and then find a way to keep fighting anyway. The alternative was unthinkable. Better to expend every last shell, drain every last power cell, fight until the machine ground to a halt from pure exhaustion, than to surrender or retreat. The Minotaurs did not know defeat. They knew only victory or death. And if death was coming, then it would arrive to find Hecaton still fighting, still resisting, still inflicting damage on the Emperor's enemies, until his very last moment of function. The ground beneath his feet shifted again, reality asserting itself in ways that made no sense, and Hecaton adjusted his stance automatically, maintaining balance through centuries of practice and neural interface refinement. An orc charged him from the left, one of the larger ones, a knob from the look of it, and Hecaton pivoted at the hip, brought the power fist around in an arc that would have been impossible for a human warrior, and caught the greenskin in the chest. The impact pulverized bone and liquefied organs, the knob's momentum carrying it forward even as the light died in its eyes, and it collapsed in a heap at Hecaton's feet. "Keep coming, ya gits!" roared Gragmek from somewhere in the chaos. "We ain't done yet!" No, Hecaton thought grimly. They certainly were not done yet. Unfortunately, neither was he. And that, he reflected as another orc fell to his multi-melter, was going to be a problem for everyone involved. A demon world is not simply a planet that happens to be occupied by the forces of chaos. It is not merely a world where chaos worshippers hold power or where demonic entities manifest with unusual frequency. A demon world is something far more fundamental and far more terrifying. It is a place where the barrier between the materium and the immaterium has been so thoroughly compromised that the distinction between the two has become academic. Reality and unreality bleed into each other, creating an environment that operates on rules that would give a tech priest a migraine and a philosopher a nervous breakdown. The process by which a world becomes a demon world typically involves prolonged exposure to warp energies, often during an extended warp rift or following a massive demonic incursion that was not properly contained. The planet's material structure becomes infused with immaterial energy, and as this corruption spreads, the laws of physics begin to break down. Gravity becomes negotiable. Time flows inconsistently. Spatial dimensions acquire an unsettling tendency to include extras that should not exist in real space. The very ground might suddenly decide it would rather be liquid or gas, or something that has no proper name in any human language. Most demon worlds are located within the Eye of Terror, that massive warp storm that has raged since the Horus Heresy, or in similar regions where the veil between dimensions is perpetually thin. But some exist in isolation, pockets of unreality scattered throughout the galaxy like cancers in otherwise healthy tissue. The Imperium maintains careful watch on known demon worlds, not because they can be reclaimed, but because they need to ensure nothing escapes from them. Exterminatus is usually ineffective against demon worlds, as the physical destruction of the planet does not address the underlying warp contamination. The demon world on which Hecaton found himself was a relatively old one, having existed in its corrupted state for several thousand years by the Imperium's reckoning, though time is a flexible concept on such places. It had once been a minor forge world, a small manufacturing center that produced nothing particularly remarkable, just another cog in the vast machine of the Imperium's industrial base. Then the warp storms came, cutting it off from the light of the Astronomicon and subjecting it to decades of exposure to raw chaos energies. When the storms finally cleared and contact was re-established, the forge world was gone. In its place was this nightmare landscape, its factories transformed into twisted cathedrals of industrial madness, its manufactorums become organic things that pulsed with unnatural life, its population either dead or changed into something that could no longer be called human by any reasonable definition. The Mechanicus declared it beyond redemption. The Inquisition marked it as a site to be avoided at all costs. And the demon world was left to fester in isolation, home to whatever entities claimed it and whatever unfortunate souls were foolish enough to set foot on its corrupted surface. The corruption that permeated the demon world was not passive. It actively sought to spread, to infect, to transform anything it touched into something more suitable for the entities that ruled this place. The air itself carried microscopic particles of warp-tainted matter, each one a potential vector for mutation or possession. The ground leaked energy that could warp flesh and twist minds. The sky bled colors that existed only in the Imperium, shades that could drive unprotected humans to madness if viewed for too long. For Hecaton, in his Dreadnought shell, this corruption represented a constant assault on his systems. His armor was blessed, sanctified with holy oils and inscribed with wards and purity seals. But even blessed armor had its limits. The warp energy pressed against every seal and joint, seeking weaknesses, probing for any gap in his defenses. His sensors reported strange readings constantly, ghosts in the data streams that might be actual threats, or might be the demon world playing tricks, distorting electromagnetic frequencies and confusing thermal signatures. The sarcophagus that contained his biological remains was particularly well protected, layer upon layer of sanctified ceramite and adamantium, forming a shell that had been designed specifically to resist the corruption of chaos. The tech marines who built it had understood that a dreadnought might someday find itself fighting on a demon world or facing down chaos sorcerers, and had constructed the sarcophagus accordingly. Faith, in the form of prayers inscribed into the very metal itself, combined with physical barriers to create a defense that the warp found difficult to penetrate. But difficult was not impossible. 382 years of exposure, even dormant exposure, had taken its toll. Hecaton could feel it, subtle degradations in his systems that might be simple mechanical failure, or might be the first signs of corruption taking root. Sensor readings that did not quite match previous baselines, response times that were fractionally slower than they should be. Nothing critical, not yet, but enough to notice, enough to concern him. The corruption was not only physical, it was spiritual, psychological, targeting the consciousness within the machine, as much as the machine itself. Chaos sought not just to destroy, but to convert, to claim loyalist warriors and turn them to the service of the dark gods. A space marine encased in a dreadnought made an appealing target. Here was a warrior whose connection to his humanity was already tenuous, whose isolation was absolute, whose suffering was constant. All it would take was the right whisper at the right moment, the proper combination of pain and promise to turn despair into damnation. Hecaton had felt those whispers during his long dormancy, soft voices at the edge of perception, offering relief from his isolation, promising connection and power, and an end to the endless waiting. The voices of demons, speaking in tones that were sometimes seductive and sometimes threatening and always persistent. He had ignored them, reciting his litanies of hate and his catechisms of duty, using the mental conditioning that all space marines received to wall off his consciousness from their influence. But 382 years is a long time, and even the strongest mental fortifications can develop cracks when subjected to constant pressure. He had felt those cracks forming, moments of doubt that he crushed immediately, but which nevertheless existed, questions about his purpose, his duty, whether his suffering served any meaningful end beyond simply demonstrating that he could endure suffering. These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that opened doors to corruption, and he had spent considerable effort during his dormancy ensuring those doors remained closed and locked. Now, awake and active again, those whispers had fallen silent. Chaos was many things, but it was not stupid. Attempting to corrupt a space marine in active combat was far more difficult than working on one during dormancy, when consciousness was adrift and vulnerable. Now Hecaton's mind was sharp, focused on immediate tactical concerns, his thoughts occupied with targeting solutions and ammunition management and the 100 small details of active warfare. There was no room for doubt when you were calculating the optimal angle to sweep your multi-melter across a charging horde of orcs. But the corruption had not abandoned its efforts. It had simply changed tactics. If it could not reach his mind directly, it would attack through his body, or rather through the machine that served as his body. His sensors were reporting increasing interference, static in the data streams that made it harder to track targets. His actuators were responding with minute delays, fractions of a second that meant nothing individually, but which accumulated into noticeable sluggishness. The amniotic fluid in his sarcophagus felt thicker, more viscous, requiring more effort to breathe. None of these issues were critical, not yet. But they were the opening moves in a longer game. The demon world's attempt to wear him down through attrition, to degrade his capabilities slowly until he could no longer effectively resist. It was a patient strategy, which was unusual for Chaos, but not unheard of on demon worlds, where the entities in charge had all the time they could want and nowhere else they needed to be. Hecaton recognized the strategy because he had studied it, back when he was still flesh and blood, back when he had been a sergeant training younger brothers in the brutal realities of warfare against chaos. You could not always prevent corruption. Sometimes you were deployed to locations where exposure to the warp was inevitable. The key was to minimize that exposure, to complete your objective and extract before the corruption could take root, and to watch for the early warning signs that your defenses were failing. Early warning signs like sensor interference and sluggish response times, and the feeling that your armor was slightly too tight and the world slightly too wrong. These were the symptoms of a demon world attempting to work its influence on sanctified machinery, probing for weaknesses it could exploit. And once it found those weaknesses, the degradation would accelerate, systems failing in cascade, until what had been a mighty war machine became a broken shell, and the consciousness within that shell became vulnerable to possession or corruption. The timeline for such degradation was unpredictable. It might take hours or days or longer, but it was coming, as inevitable as sunrise on a world with a normal star and a sensible relationship with physics. Hecaton was fighting on borrowed time, his effectiveness steadily declining even as his ammunition reserves drained away. The question was not whether his systems would fail. The question was whether they would fail before he had completed his objective, which raised the important question of what, exactly, his objective was. Survival seemed like the obvious answer, but survival to what end? He was stranded on a demon world with no prospect of rescue, fighting orcs while chaos corruption eroded his systems. Even if he defeated every orc in this warband, even if he somehow survived the attempts at corruption, what then? Wait for another 300 years until his power finally depleted completely, gradually degrade into immobility, aware but unable to act, a consciousness trapped in a dead machine on a world that existed in defiance of every natural law? These were not pleasant thoughts, and Hecaton pushed them aside with the same mental discipline that had let him wall off the whispers of demons. Objectives could be defined later. Right now, the immediate objective was clear enough. Do not let the orcs loot him. Do not let the corruption claim him. Fight for as long as fighting was possible. Everything else was secondary. Another orc fell to his power fist, its body reduced to component elements that painted the corrupted ground in shades of red and green. The multi-melter fired again, energy reserves dropping another fraction. Another cluster of greenskins converted to superheated gas and ash. And Hecaton advanced another step, each movement slightly slower than the last. The machine responding to his will, but with increasing reluctance, like a faithful warhorse that was nearing the end of its strength. The sky above cycled through another impossible color, something between violet and a scream, and Hecaton felt the corruption press harder against his defenses. The demon world was paying attention now, its malevolent awareness focused on this small valley and the battle raging within it. It watched with the same interest a human might watch an ant struggling in amber, curious to see how long the struggle would last before inevitable fate asserted itself. Hecaton did not look up at that sky. He kept his optical sensors locked on the orcs before him, on the immediate threats that could be engaged and destroyed. The sky and its implications were problems for philosophers and madmen. He was neither. He was a weapon, and weapons had no business contemplating the nature of the universe. They had business killing the enemies of the Emperor, and there were plenty of those available to kill. So that was what he would do until he could not do it anymore. The valley echoed with the sounds of battle, bolter fire, and orc war cries, and the thunder of a dreadnought's weapons. All of it set against the background hum of a demon world's perpetual wrongness. And in the distance, beyond the immediate chaos, something else was stirring, drawn by the conflict, interested in the outcome. The demons were coming, because of course they were. On a demon world, violence was like blood in water, attracting predators from across the corrupted landscape. This situation, Hecaton reflected grimly, was getting worse at a rate that even by Minotaurs' standards could be called problematic. To understand how orcs view technology, one must first understand that orcs do not think the way humans do. This is not a value judgment. It is simply a statement of observable fact. Orc brains are structured differently, prioritizing different types of information, processing data through cognitive pathways that would baffle a human neurologist. And nowhere is this difference more apparent than in their relationship with machinery. Humans understand technology through the lens of cause and effect, through principles of engineering and physics that describe how components interact to produce desired outcomes. A human tech priest can explain in exhaustive detail why a bolter fires, tracing the chain of mechanical events from trigger pull to primer ignition to propellant combustion to projectile acceleration. An orc knows only that when you pull the trigger, the gun goes dakka, and that is sufficient. This is not ignorance, though it might appear that way to an outside observer. It is a fundamentally different epistemology, a different way of knowing and understanding the world. Orcs have an instinctive, almost psychic connection to machinery. They can look at a pile of scrap and see, in their own peculiar way, what it could become. They can cobble together weapons from components that should not work together, creating guns that fire when by all rights they should explode, vehicles that run on fuel mixtures that would destroy a regular engine. The secret, insofar as there is a secret, lies in the orc psychic gestalt field. Orcs are latent psychers, every one of them, though not in the traditional sense. They do not throw fireballs or read minds. Instead, their collective unconscious belief shapes reality in subtle but measurable ways. When enough orcs believe that red vehicles go faster, red vehicles actually do go faster, at least when orcs are the ones driving them. When an orc believes that his weapon will fire, the weapon fires, even if it is missing components that an Imperial weapons engineer would consider essential. This means that orc technology operates on a principle that the Adeptus Mechanicus finds deeply offensive. It works because orcs believe it should work. Logic is negotiable. Engineering is a suggestion. The laws of physics are more like guidelines that reality follows most of the time, but is willing to bend when sufficiently large numbers of orcs are concentrating on something. The orcs who work with technology are called mech boys, and they are to orc society what tech priests are to the Imperium, though they would be horrified by the comparison. Mech boys have an intuitive understanding of how to make things go, an instinct for which bits should be connected to which other bits, and a complete disregard for concepts like safety protocols or planned maintenance schedules. They build by inspiration and intuition, slapping components together with whatever comes to hand, using welding torches and hammers and sheer, bloody-minded determination to force disparate pieces of technology into functional wholes. The results are often spectacular, always dangerous, and occasionally genius. A mech might create a weapon that fires explosive rounds made from ammunition that should not explode, powered by a mechanism that exists somewhere in the space between mechanical engineering and wishful thinking. He might build a vehicle that runs faster than its engine should allow, held together by welds that would fail any structural integrity test, but which persist anyway, because the mech believes they will hold, and so they do. This same principle applies when orcs encounter technology from other species, where a human might look at a space marine dreadnought and see a complex machine requiring extensive knowledge to operate or maintain. An orc looks at it and sees something else entirely. They see possibility. They see loot. They see a pile of really good bits that could be repurposed for orc use, and the fact that those bits are currently arranged in the shape of a war machine containing a very angry space marine is merely an obstacle to be overcome, not a reason to abandon the project. The specific orc clan most associated with looting is the Death Skulls, those blue-painted scavengers who believe that anything not nailed down is fair game for appropriation, and anything that is nailed down just needs a bigger crowbar. Death Skulls have elevated looting to an art form, an obsession, practically a religion. They strip battlefields clean of anything remotely valuable, hauling off enemy equipment even while the battle is still raging. They have been known to loot from other orcs, from allies, and on at least one recorded occasion, from themselves when a Death Skull forgot which pile of scrap he had hidden his favorite shooter in. The blue war paint that Death Skulls favor is, in their belief system, lucky. And since orc beliefs shape reality, it probably is lucky, at least for them. Death Skulls survive situations that would kill other orcs, walk away from explosions that should have reduced them to their component atoms, and generally demonstrate a tendency toward improbable good fortune that makes other orc clans both envious and suspicious. This luck extends to their looting. A Death Skull can somehow always find the best bits in any pile of wreckage, can identify valuable salvage, with an instinct that borders on precognition. When orcs loot enemy vehicles, they do not merely steal them and use them as is. That would be far too straightforward and not nearly orky enough. Instead, they improve them, which is to say they strip out anything that looks too complicated or fragile, replace it with orc components that are simpler and more robust, add extra weapons because more dakka is always better, slap on additional armor plating because you can never have too much armor, and paint the whole thing in garish colors because if you are going to have a looted vehicle, it should at least look proper orky. The results are called looted wagons, and they are a source of equal parts pride and frustration for orc mechs. Pride, because they have taken enemy technology and made it better, or at least more orky, which amounts to the same thing in orc logic. Frustration because looted technology still sometimes acts funny, refusing to work the way orc technology should, requiring strange rituals or specific procedures that no self-respecting orc wants to bother with. Looted. Imperial vehicles are particularly common, simply because the Imperium is enormous, and orcs fight Imperial forces more often than any other faction. Leman Russ, battle tanks, chimera transports, rhinos, all of these have been repurposed for orc use. Their original heraldry scratched out or painted over. Their systems simplified down to the point where even the most thick-headed orc can understand the basic operation. The fact that these improvements usually reduce the vehicle's overall effectiveness by Imperial standards is irrelevant. By orc standards, a tank that fires randomly but really loudly is better than one that fires accurately but boringly. But the orcs in Gragmek's warband were looking at something significantly more complex than a Leman Russ or a chimera. They were looking at a Dreadnought, and Dreadnoughts represent a special category of loot, one that crosses the line from vehicle into, I'm not actually sure what this is, but I want it. A Dreadnought is not simply a vehicle that can be driven or a weapon that can be fired. It is a cybernetic organism, a fusion of biological consciousness and mechanical systems so complete that the distinction between pilot and machine becomes academic. It is also, from an orc perspective, absolutely crumpin' brilliant. Here is a war machine that walks on two legs, that carries enough firepower to level buildings, that is armored well enough to shrug off hits that would destroy lesser machines, and that, most importantly, looks dead impressive and would make an excellent centerpiece for any proper orc warband. The mech boys in Gragmek's group had been practically salivating from the moment they detected the power signature that led them to Hecaton. A Dreadnought was the kind of loot that mechs dreamed about, the sort of find that could make a mech's reputation and earn him the respect of every other mech in the clan. The fact that it was still functional, still containing a very much alive and hostile space marine, was a complication, certainly, but not an insurmountable one. Orcs have never let minor details like massive firepower or extreme danger stop them from pursuing something they want. The lead mech in the warband was a scarred veteran named Grisnak, who had been looting Imperial technology for longer than some humans had been alive. He had looted Leman Russes, Predators, even a Basilisk artillery piece, that he had somehow managed to mount on a battle wagon chassis, creating a mobile artillery platform that was as likely to explode as it was to hit its target, but which was undeniably impressive when it worked. But a dreadnought, that would be the crowning achievement of his career, the loot that would make his name legendary among mechs. Right, Grisnak had said, studying the dormant dreadnought before his compatriot's ill-advised jumpstart had awakened it. Here's what we do. We gets that thingy working. We jimmies open the sarcophagus. We pulls out the beaky, and then we straps in one of da boys. Make ourselves a proper orc dreadnought. This plan had several flaws, not least of which was the assumption that the dreadnought would cooperate with being looted. The other mechs had nodded along anyway, because the plan involved looting, and looting was always a good idea in orc logic, regardless of minor issues like feasibility or personal safety. Now, with the dreadnought very much awake and actively reducing the warband's numbers, Grisnak was reconsidering some aspects of his plan. Specifically, the parts where he had assumed the Space Marine inside would just politely wait while they figured out how to open the sarcophagus. That assumption had turned out to be wildly optimistic, and several of his fellow mechs were now very dead as a consequence. But Grisnak had not survived decades of looting by giving up at the first sign of resistance. If anything, resistance made the loot more valuable. Any git could steal an unguarded truck. It took a proper mech to loot a dreadnought that was actively trying to kill you. The question was how to go about it, given that direct confrontation was proving somewhat hazardous to continued existence. "All right, you gits," Grisnak shouted to the other mechs who were taking cover behind whatever they could find. "The beaky's got shooters and a big crump in hand. We gotta get him to run out of Dakar, then we crump him into joints till he can't move no more. Then we cuts him open nice and easy like." "What if he don't run out of Dakar?" one of the younger mechs called back. "Then we all die and some other gits'll loot him instead. Now stop asking stupid questions and start shooting." And that, in essence, was the orc plan. Survive long enough for the dreadnought to run out of ammunition, then disable it and claim the prize. It was not an elegant plan. It was not a safe plan. But it was an orc plan, which meant it involved a lot of violence and an optimistic attitude toward casualty rates. And for orcs, that was generally sufficient. The battle in the valley had been raging for approximately 47 minutes by Hecaton's chronometer, though time was slippery on demon worlds, and that number might be wildly inaccurate. What was not inaccurate was his ammunition count, which continued its steady decline toward zero. The multi-melter had perhaps 6 more shots remaining at full power before it needed to recharge, and recharging would take time he did not have. His Power Fist's energy cells were at 60% capacity, which sounded adequate until you considered that each swing drained approximately 3%, and the orcs showed no signs of running out of bodies to throw at him. Worse, his systems were beginning to exhibit the warning signs he had been dreading. Response times were measurably slower now, not just fractions of seconds, but entire seconds of delay between thought and action. His targeting systems were degrading, accuracy dropping as sensor data became increasingly corrupted by interference. That might be electromagnetic and might be something more sinister. The hydraulics in his left leg were grinding, a sound that should not exist in properly maintained machinery, suggesting that either particulates had gotten into the system or the demon world's corruption was accelerating mechanical wear at an impossible rate. He was, in technical terms, in deep trouble. In Minotaurs' terms, this was a target-rich environment with suboptimal equipment functionality. In practical terms, he needed to change tactics, or this fight would end very badly for him. The orcs seemed to have reached a similar conclusion, though their reasoning was more along the lines of, "Debiki is crumping us pretty good, we should be more sneaky-like." They had stopped charging directly at him, and were instead using the broken terrain of the valley as cover, popping out to fire and then ducking back before his return fire could reach them. It was shockingly competent for orcs, which suggested that either they were blood axes, that clan of orcs, who actually bothered with things like strategy and cover, or they were learning from experience, which was an alarming prospect. Gragmek, watching from his vantage point on a rise of corrupted stone that might once have been bedrock and now looked disturbingly organic, was indeed learning. He had led enough wars to understand the basic principle of combat, which was that if you threw enough boys at a problem, the problem eventually went away. But dreadnoughts were a special category of problem, one that required a bit more finesse. Finesse being a relative term when applied to orc warfare. "All right," he rumbled to Rukbad, and the other knobs gathered around him. "Dabiki's running low on Daka. I can tell from the way he's shooting. Not wasting shots like he was at the start. That means he knows he's in trouble." "So what do we do, boss?" Rukbad asked. "We make him waste what he's got left, send in the grots." The Gretchen, those smaller, more cowardly cousins of the Orks, had been hanging back from the main battle, content to let their larger kin do the actual fighting. Now they looked up in horror as approximately 200 grots suddenly found themselves volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. Gretchen are not brave. They are not stupid either usually, and they could see very clearly what happened to things that got in the Dreadnought's way. But Gretchen also understand the Orc hierarchy, which places them at the very bottom, and they know what happens to grots who disobey orders from their bosses. Given the choice between certain death from the Dreadnought and probable death followed by certain torture from angry Orcs, the grots chose the option that at least offered a small chance of survival if they were very lucky and very fast. Hecaton watched through his optical sensors as a wave of small, greenish figures came boiling out of cover, chittering and screaming in their high-pitched voices. He recognized them as Gretchen. He had fought Orcs enough times to know their various subspecies and support units, and he understood immediately what this represented. The Orcs were using the Gretchen as ammunition sinks, forcing him to expend shots on targets that did not represent significant threats. It was actually tactically sound, which was irritating on multiple levels. Hecaton swept his multi-melter across the wave of Gretchen, reducing dozens of them to superheated vapor, but there were too many, and they were too spread out. He would have to fire multiple times to clear them all, and each shot was one he could not spare. His power fist caught several that got close enough, swatting them like insects, but even that was draining his energy reserves. Behind the Gretchen, he could see the larger Orcs preparing to advance, using their smaller kin as living cover. They were coordinating, actually working together in a way that suggested either leadership or experience, or both. These were not the mindless brutes that Imperial propaganda often portrayed Orcs as being. These were intelligent, adaptable enemies who understood battlefield tactics and were applying them effectively. Hecaton made a decision. He pivoted, bringing his full attention to bear not on the Gretchen, but on the Orcs behind them, and fired his multi-melter at full power directly into the largest cluster of greenskins he could identify. The beam lanced across the valley, carving a line of devastation through the Orc position, reducing cover to molten slag and Orcs to ash. It was a gamble, burning ammunition to eliminate commanders and specialists rather than the more numerous but less threatening Gretchen, but it was a calculated gamble. The Orcs scattered, their coordination disrupted, and in that moment of chaos, Hecaton advanced. Not back, not retreating, but forward, into the mass of Gretchen and toward the Orc position. It was counterintuitive, aggressive where caution might seem more appropriate, but it was also Minotaur's doctrine. Never yield ground, never give the enemy time to regroup. Press the attack until the enemy breaks or you do. The Gretchen fled before him, those that could, their small legs pumping as they tried desperately to get clear of the walking death machine. Hecaton crushed them beneath his feet without attention, each step a minor earthquake that sent smaller bodies flying. His power fist swept in wide arcs, clearing his path, his optical sensors locked on the Orc positions ahead. The multi-melter was nearly exhausted, but he did not need it now. Close combat would serve, and in close combat, a Dreadnought's advantages were overwhelming. He reached the first Orc position and went through it like a wrecking ball through a wall. Orcs tried to stand their ground, tried to fight back, and died for their courage. The power fist crushed armor and flesh with equal ease. His footfalls shook the ground, destabilizing his enemies, making it harder for them to maintain their footing. He was a walking, stomping embodiment of the Emperor's wrath, and for a few glorious moments, he was unstoppable. Then his left leg hydraulics failed completely. The grinding sound he had been hearing became a shriek of tortured metal, the hydraulic cylinder seizing up mid-stride. Hecaton's forward momentum carried him another step, but the leg would not properly support his weight, and he felt himself tilting, falling, the ground rushing up toward him in a way that would have been comical if it were not potentially catastrophic. He hit hard, the impact jarring every system in his chassis, warning indicators lighting up across his consciousness like a festival of bad news. The fall had done additional damage, nothing critical, but multiple minor failures that accumulated into significant degradation of function. His left arm's power fist flickered, the energy field destabilizing. His right arm's multi-melter, already nearly depleted, discharged its remaining power in an uncontrolled burst that melted a random section of ground into glass. And Hecaton lay on the corrupted soil of the demon world, unable to rise, his systems in cascade failure, while approximately 100 very angry orcs realized that their prey was now vulnerable and began to close in with enthusiastic bloodlust. From his position on the rise, Gragmek allowed himself what might have been called a smile, if orcs actually did smiling, which they generally do not. "Right, now we got him. Grab them chains and ropes. We's gonna haul dat thing back to the mechs." The battle, it seemed, had entered its final phase, and Hecaton, for the first time in his long existence as a dreadnought, was forced to confront the possibility that he might not be walking away from this one. If you want to support the channel and see more deep dives into the lore and stories of Warhammer 40k, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps tremendously, and it lets me know you want more content like this. Now, back to our story. Lying on the ground presented Hecaton with a problem he had not anticipated, though in retrospect, he perhaps should have. A dreadnought is designed to be upright, to fight on its feet, to use its considerable mass and strength to dominate the battlefield through mobility and firepower. When a dreadnought falls, especially one whose left leg hydraulics have failed, getting back up becomes not a matter of simply standing, but a complex engineering challenge that requires functional systems and time, neither of which Hecaton currently possessed in adequate quantities. His remaining operational systems were reporting damage across multiple categories. The fall had cracked his sarcophagus's outer shell, not deeply enough to breach the inner sanctum where his biological remains floated, but enough that warning runes were blazing in his consciousness. Structural integrity was compromised. Several power conduits had been severed or damaged. His targeting systems had degraded from problematic to actively misleading, feeding him sensor data that contradicted itself from moment to moment. The amniotic fluid in his sarcophagus was viscous enough now that breathing it required conscious effort, his adapted lungs straining to process the thickened liquid, and his weapons were exhausted. The multi-melter had dumped its remaining power in that final, uncontrolled discharge. The power fist still functioned, technically, but its energy field was fluctuating wildly, meaning any strike might or might not actually be effective. He had become, in essence, a very large, very heavily armored box, containing a consciousness that could still think, but could no longer meaningfully fight. This was not how Hecaton had envisioned ending his existence. He had always assumed that when his time came, it would be in battle, yes, but in a battle where he could at least inflict damage on his enemies until the very last moment. To be reduced to helplessness while still conscious, while still aware, was a uniquely terrible fate for a warrior who had defined his existence through combat effectiveness. The orcs were approaching now, more cautiously than before, Gragmek's orders having penetrated even their battle-fevered minds. They carried chains, heavy ropes, crude harnesses that they had apparently been prepared to use for salvaging heavy equipment. The fact that the equipment in question was currently alive and hostile did not seem to concern them overmuch. Orcs, after all, are not known for their concerns about workplace safety. Grisnak the mech was among the first to reach the fallen dreadnought, his eyes scanning the armored form with the kind of intense focus that an art collector might use when examining a rare masterpiece. "Right," he said, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. Sarcophagus is here. See the bull symbol? That's where the beaky is. We pop that open, get rid of the beaky, then we can use this thing for ourselves. What if the beaky won't come out nice like? Asked one of the other mechs. Then we pulls him out not nice like. Now get them chains around our arms. We's gonna tie it down proper before we starts cutting. Inside his sarcophagus, Hecaton listened to this conversation through his external audio pickups and felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. He felt fear. Not the simple tactical concern that comes from being in danger, but genuine, existential fear at the prospect of what the Orks were planning. To be pulled from the sarcophagus, to be exposed to the air of this demon world after centuries of isolation, to die not in battle, but in some crude Ork workshop, while mechs poked at his withered flesh trying to figure out how he connected to the machine, that was a fate worse than simple death. He tried to move, to activate any system that might still respond, but his body, his real body, the biological remains inside the sarcophagus, could not affect the machine when the machine's systems were not functional. He was trapped, truly trapped, in a way that he had never been before. All the isolation he had felt during his years of service, all the times he had thought of himself as a prisoner in the sarcophagus, those were nothing compared to this. Then, at least, he had agency. He could move, could fight, could act. Now he was reduced to a consciousness in a box, able to perceive but not to affect, and the Orks were preparing to crack that box open like an exceptionally violent child opening a present. The chains were looped around his arms, Orks pulling them tight, securing the limbs so they could not lash out even if power were restored. More chains went around his torso, binding him further. He could feel the pressure through his sensors, the machine's body reporting forces being applied even as its ability to respond to those forces was shut down. It was a strange, dissociating sensation, like feeling someone grab your arm when your arm was made of metal and ceramite and weighed several tons. Grisnak approached the sarcophagus with a crude cutting torch, one of those mech boy specials that was basically a welding torch with the safety features removed and the power output increased to dangerous levels. Right, let's see what's inside the pretty box. The cutting torch ignited with a roar, and Grisnak brought it close to the edge of the sarcophagus, where the outer shell met the inner, looking for a seam he could exploit. The heat was immediate and intense, hot enough that even through the layers of protection, Hecaton could feel it. Not physical heat, his body was too far removed from the outer shell for that, but heat registered by sensors, translated into data, interpreted by his consciousness as burning. It was not pleasant. And then something happened that no one had anticipated. The demon world, which had been watching this spectacle with what passed for interest among malevolent warp entities, decided that it had seen enough. The ground began to shake, not like an earthquake, but like something living shifting in its sleep. The impossible sky darkened further, colors bleeding into shades that hurt to perceive. And from the edges of the valley, from the twisted forest and the corrupted stone, demons began to manifest. They came in forms that defied easy description. Some were humanoid, after a fashion, though their proportions were wrong and their features were those of nightmares given flesh. Others were more abstract, geometries with too many angles, concepts made physical, abstract malevolence sculpted from the substance of the warp itself. They moved with the fluid grace of things that did not strictly obey physics, flowing across the ground or through it, approaching the Orks with deliberate menace. The Orks, to their credit, reacted exactly as Orks would react to the sudden appearance of new enemies. They stopped what they were doing, grabbed their weapons, and prepared to have the best fight of their first short, violent lives. Gragmek's roar cut across the valley. All right, boys. Looks like we got some bonus crumping to do. Leave the Dreadnought for now and kill these geets first. The Orks and demons crashed together in a melee that would have given military tacticians migraines trying to map. There was no formation, no strategy, just raw violence in its purest form. Orks swung their crude weapons at entities that bled colors instead of blood. Demons tore at green flesh with claws that were sometimes solid, and sometimes not. The ground churned beneath their feet, the demon world's substance responding to the violence being inflicted upon it, trying to participate in the slaughter in its own mindless way. For Hecaton, chained and helpless, the arrival of the demons was a blessing and a curse in equal measure. Blessing because it gave him time. The Orks were now occupied with something other than cutting open his sarcophagus. Curse because demons represented a different kind of threat, one that his physical armor could not fully protect against. Demons could affect consciousness directly, could reach past physical barriers to strike at the soul, and Hecaton's soul was significantly more accessible now that his sarcophagus's outer shell was cracked. He could feel them probing at him, whispers returning, but different now, more immediate, more threatening. They spoke in voices that seemed to come from inside his own thoughts, offering things that would have been tempting if he had been anyone other than who he was. They offered freedom from the sarcophagus, freedom from duty, freedom from the endless cycle of battle and sleep and battle again. They offered power, the ability to stand and fight without relying on failing machinery. They offered connection, an end to the isolation that had defined his existence for centuries. And Hecaton, warrior of the Minotaurs, servant of the Emperor, consciousness bound to a machine, rejected them utterly. He had spent 382 years resisting these whispers. He had endured isolation that would have broken lesser beings. He had maintained his faith and his duty through centuries of silence and darkness and the constant, patient assault of corruption. He would not break now, not when the end was so close, not when surrender would mean everything he had endured was meaningless. He reached deep into the mental conditioning that all space marines received, the hypno-indoctrination and psychosurgery that rebuilt their minds into weapons as surely as their bodies were rebuilt into living instruments of war. He recited litanies that had been drilled into him as a scout, prayers that had been reinforced through centuries of service. He focused on his hatred of the Emperor's enemies, using that hatred as a shield against the whispers, letting his rage burn away the temptation before it could take root. And somehow, impossibly, the corruption faltered. The whispers drew back, frustrated, unable to find purchase on a consciousness that refused to give them even the smallest foothold. Hecaton was not stronger than the demons. He was not more powerful than the corruption of the demon world. But he was stubborn, in the way that only a space marine can be stubborn, in the way that only someone who has endured centuries of suffering without breaking can be stubborn. And sometimes, in the grim darkness of the far future, stubbornness is enough. The battle between the Orks and demons raged for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Time, as has been established, was slippery on demon worlds, and in the middle of violent combat, it tended to become even more unreliable. Orks fell, their bodies dissolving into spores that would eventually grow into new orks if the demon world's corruption did not prevent it. Demons were banished, sent screaming back into the warp when sufficient violence was applied to their material forms. The ground was churned into a substance that was part mud, part flesh, part something that had no name in any human language. Gragmek fought in the thick of it, his power claw tearing through demonic forms with vicious efficiency. He was laughing, great booming guffaws that echoed across the valley, because this was what Orks lived for. This was the good fight, the proper fight, the kind of battle that made existence worthwhile. Around him, his boys fought with equal enthusiasm, their crude weapons and brutal strength pitted against entities that existed partially outside reality. It was glorious, and more than a few Orks died happy, sent to join Gork and Mork in whatever afterlife Orks believed in, which was probably one long continuous battle with unlimited enemies and weapons that never ran out of Daka. But even Ork enthusiasm has limits, especially when the enemies keep manifesting from thin air faster than you can kill them. Gragmek was smart enough to recognize when a fight was turning from entertainment into a tactical problem. The demons were not depleting. For every one they banished, two more seemed to appear. The demon world was feeding them, providing an endless supply of warp energy to sustain their manifestations. The Orks could fight forever, they were willing to, but they could not win. Not here, not against an entire planet's worth of corruption. "Rookbad!" Gragmek bellowed. "Get the boys together! We's pulling back!" "What about the Dreadnought?" Rookbad shouted back, currently occupied with beating a demon to death with another, slightly smaller demon. Gragmek looked over to where the fallen Dreadnought lay, still chained, still helpless, now partially buried under the corpses of Orks and demons alike. Part of him wanted to grab it anyway, to haul it back to the trucks regardless of the strategic situation, because leaving good loot behind was offensive to everything he believed in. But another part, the part that had kept him alive long enough to become a war boss, recognized that you could not loot anything if you were dead. "Leave it!" he roared, and the words physically hurt to say. "We'll come back for it when we got more boys and bigger guns." The Orks began a fighting retreat, still engaging the demons but moving steadily toward their vehicles. It was not the most organized withdrawal ever executed. Orks do not really do organized withdrawals, but it was effective enough. They piled into their trucks and battle wagons, engines roaring to life, and began the journey back across the corrupted landscape toward wherever they had made camp. The demons did not pursue far. They had no particular interest in the Orks now that the violence was ending. They drifted back toward the edges of the valley, their attention turning to the more interesting prize that remained. The Dreadnought, the Space Marine. The consciousness that had resisted corruption for so long, that had rejected their offers, that had maintained its faith against all their efforts. That was a challenge. That was interesting. That was worth effort. Hecaton felt them gathering, felt their attention focus on him like sunlight through a magnifying glass. He was alone now, truly alone. The Orks were gone. His systems were failing. His weapons were exhausted. His body was chained and broken. And the demons were coming, not to destroy him, but to claim him, to wear him down through patience and persistence, until his will finally broke, and he surrendered to the corruption he had resisted for so long. He prepared himself for what was to come, reciting prayers under his breath. Well, not breath exactly. He was breathing amniotic fluid, but the mental equivalent of breath. He gathered his strength, such as it was. He focused on his duty, his faith, his hatred of the enemies of the Emperor. He prepared to resist for as long as resistance was possible, and then to resist longer still, because that was what Space Marines did. That was what Minotaurs did. They did not surrender. They did not break. They endured. And in the distance, far across the twisted landscape of the demon world, something else was stirring. Something that had been traveling toward this location since the moment Hecaton awakened. Drawn by the signature of loyal technology and faith in the Emperor, operating on a world that should contain neither. Something that represented, if not salvation, then at least the possibility of continued purpose. But that is a development for later. For now, Hecaton lay in the valley, surrounded by corpses and corruption, while the demons gathered to begin their final assault on his soul. And he waited, and he prayed, and he prepared to show these warp-spawned abominations exactly what it meant to face a warrior of the Minotaurs who refused to yield, even when yielding was the only rational option left. The universe, it has been observed, has a dark sense of humor. It delights in putting individuals in situations that test the very limits of their endurance, and then, just when those limits seem about to be reached, it finds ways to make things worse. For Hecaton, the universe's joke was becoming less funny by the moment. The demons did not attack him directly, at least not in the physical sense. They circled his fallen form, keeping just at the edge of his sensor range, their presence a constant pressure against his awareness. They whispered, not loudly but persistently, a background noise of temptation and threat that he could not entirely block out. They showed him visions, images projected directly into his consciousness, bypassing his optical senses to paint pictures on the inside of his mind. They showed him what he had been, back when he was flesh and blood, back when he could walk on his own legs and feel the weight of armor on his shoulders and breathe air that did not have to be processed through adapted lungs. They showed him his brothers, the warriors he had fought beside before his interment, and they whispered that those brothers were all dead now, dust and memory, while he endured in this metal prison with no hope of escape. They showed him alternative futures, paths he could take if only he would accept their gifts. They could free him from the sarcophagus, give him a new body, one that would not fail or degrade, one that could feel pleasure and pain in ways his current existence did not permit. All he had to do was surrender, was acknowledge that the Emperor had abandoned him, was accept that 382 years of dormancy on this demon world proved that his service was meaningless and his sacrifice unappreciated. Hecaton rejected these visions with the same stubborn refusal he had maintained throughout his long dormancy. The demons could show him whatever they wanted. They could paint any picture, weave any narrative. None of it changed the fundamental truth of his existence. He was a warrior of the Minotaurs. He served the Emperor. His duty was to resist the enemies of the Imperium, and the demons were the greatest of those enemies. Everything else was irrelevant. But rejection required energy, mental and spiritual energy, and energy was finite. The constant assault was wearing him down, not quickly, but steadily, erosion rather than explosion. He could feel his thoughts becoming sluggish, his prayers less focused, his concentration wavering. The corruption of the demon world had been working on him for centuries, and now the demons were pressing that advantage, using his weakened state to probe deeper, to find gaps in his mental defenses, to whisper in moments when his guard wavered. The physical corruption was accelerating too. The crack in his sarcophagus's outer shell was widening, microscopic fissures spreading through the ceramite like cracks in ice. The amniotic fluid was becoming more viscous, more difficult to breathe, and there was a taste to it now that he did not recognize and did not like. His biological body, that withered, atrophied thing that he had not actually seen in centuries, was starting to feel sensations it should not feel, phantom pains that suggested the demon world's influence was reaching even that deeply protected core. He was, in short, running out of time. His systems were failing, his body was being corrupted, his mind was being assaulted, and he had no weapons, no mobility, no way to fight back against enemies that did not strictly exist in physical space. All he had was his will, and will alone, as it turned out, was not sufficient when pitted against an entire demon world's worth of corruption. The sky above had gone completely dark now, not the darkness of night but the darkness of the void, of empty space between stars, of places where light feared to travel. The ground beneath him was moving, not violently, but slowly, almost sensuously, like flesh breathing. The air was thick enough to see, colors swirling in patterns that suggested meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. The demon world was focusing its full attention on this small valley, on this fallen warrior, pouring its power into the effort to claim or destroy him. Hecaton tried to move again, more out of habit than any real hope that his systems had suddenly repaired themselves. The result was the same as before. Nothing. No response. His body, his machine body, was inert, as dead as the space marines whose tombs he had been placed beside during his periodic wakings. He was consciousness trapped in a failing shell, and the shell was failing faster now, systems cascading into shutdown as the corruption accelerated their decline. He found himself thinking, in a moment of dark humor that surprised him, that this was probably not how the chapter had envisioned his service ending. The Minotaurs treated their dreadnoughts with indifference, yes, but even they expected their ancient warriors to fall in battle against the Imperium's enemies, not to lie helpless on a demon world while chaos slowly dissolved them from the inside out. There would be no recovery of his sarcophagus, no final rest in the chapter's mausoleum, no honors or remembrance, just a slow fade into corruption, and then nothing. That thought should have bothered him more than it did. Perhaps he had been a warrior too long to care about posthumous honors. Perhaps 382 years in silence had taught him that legacy was a luxury, and survival was all that mattered. Or perhaps he was simply too exhausted, mentally and spiritually exhausted, to muster the emotional energy for regret or anger about his situation. The demons sensed this exhaustion. They pressed harder, whispers becoming voices, voices becoming shouts, shouts becoming a roar of corruption that threatened to drown out his own thoughts. They were so close now, on the very edge of breaking through his defenses, of reaching the core of his consciousness and reshaping it to their purposes. All it would take was one moment of weakness, one instant where his concentration faltered and they would be inside, wearing his mind like a suit of clothes, puppeting his body if his systems ever became functional again. And in that moment, when Hecaton was perhaps 2 thoughts away from experiencing corruption firsthand, when the demons were gathering for their final assault on his consciousness, when the demon world was pouring everything it had into claiming this single, stubborn prize, something happened that no one had predicted. Reality hiccuped. There is no better way to describe it. The demon world, which had been steadily grinding away at normal physics for thousands of years, suddenly found itself interrupted. The flow of warp energy that sustained its existence flickered, just for an instant, like a candle flame in a breeze. The demons paused, their whispers falling silent, confusion rippling through their collective consciousness. Even the demon world itself seemed to hesitate, its malevolent attention suddenly divided. And into that moment of distraction came thunder, not metaphorical thunder, actual thunder, the sound of atmospheric compression caused by massive objects moving at high speed through air. Hecaton's external audio pickups, still functional despite everything else, caught the sound and identified it. Engines. Big engines. Military-grade engines running at full power. And they were coming this way. The demons scattered, their manifestations becoming less stable as whatever power had been sustaining them was suddenly diverted elsewhere. The sky, which had been locked in permanent darkness, began to lighten, cycling through rapid changes as the demon world attempted to process this new development. The ground stopped its breathing motion, becoming temporarily solid again, as if the entire planet was holding its breath in surprise. And over the edge of the valley, moving with the kind of speed that suggested urgency bordering on recklessness, came a Thunderhawk gunship. It was not painted bronze and brass. It bore no heraldry of the Minotaurs. Its colors were black and white, a checkerboard pattern that Hecaton recognized from his extensive tactical database as belonging to a chapter far more rare than even his own. The Death Spectres, those mysterious warriors who claimed to commune with the dead, who served on the edges of the Imperium's domain, who appeared and disappeared with disturbing unpredictability. The Thunderhawk did not land. Landing would have taken time, and time was clearly something the pilot felt they did not have. Instead, it dropped to a hover approximately 50 feet above the valley floor, its engines screaming as they fought gravity and the demon world's attempts to interfere with their operation. The rear ramp dropped, and figures in black and white power armor began fast roping down, moving with the practiced efficiency of warriors who had executed this maneuver countless times before. They hit the ground and immediately formed a defensive perimeter, bolt guns sweeping across the valley, acquiring targets among the few demons that had not yet fled. A chaplain was among them, his skull-faced helm immediately identifiable, and he strode forward toward Hecaton's position with the kind of confidence that suggested either bravery or insanity, or both. "Brother Ancient," the chaplain called out, his vocabulator giving his words weight and authority. "I am Chaplain Amosis of the Death Spectres. We have come to extract you. Your service is not yet ended." Hecaton tried to respond, to question how they had found him, to ask what they were doing on a demon world, to point out the multiple problems with their extraction plan, starting with the fact that he was chained and his systems were not functional. What came out of his speakers was a burst of static followed by something that might charitably be interpreted as language, but which mostly sounded like mechanical grinding. Chaplain Amosis apparently understood anyway, or possibly he just did not care about the specifics. "Do not speak. Conserve your strength. We will handle the rest." He turned to his brothers. "Cut those chains. Get him mobile. We have approximately 7 minutes before this planet realizes we are here and decides to do something about it." The Death Spectres moved with practiced efficiency, their chainswords making quick work of the crude orc chains that bound Hecaton's arms. 2 of them, tech marines from the look of their more elaborate armor, immediately began working on his leg hydraulics, their mechadendrites probing into the damaged systems with the kind of familiarity that suggested extensive experience working with ancient machinery. "Temporary repair only," one of the tech marines muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Full restoration will require facilities we do not have here, but we can get you mobile enough for extraction, maybe." "Maybe is not a word I prefer to hear," Chaplain Amosis observed dryly. "Maybe is the best I can offer given the circumstances." While the tech marines worked, the other Death Spectres maintained their perimeter, their weapons tracking across the valley as demons began to manifest again, the demon world recovering from its surprise and preparing to contest this intrusion. Bolt of fire barked out, the distinctive sound of mass-reactive shells detonating against demonic flesh. The chaplain raised his Crozius Arcanum, the power weapon crackling with blue energy, and the demons nearest to him recoiled, repelled by the holy symbols and faith that the weapon embodied. "How long?" Amosis demanded. 4 minutes, the tech marine replied. "Possibly 3. I am not certain the repairs will hold." They will hold. They must. And somehow, impossibly, the repairs did hold. The tech marines bypassed the damaged components, rerouted power through backup systems that Hecaton had not even known existed, and jury-rigged a solution that would have made any tech priest weep, but which worked well enough for immediate purposes. Hecaton felt his systems responding again, sluggish but functional, his left leg accepting weight when he tried to stand. He rose, slowly, ponderously, tons of metal and ceramite fighting gravity and damage, and the demon world's attempts to interfere. For a moment, he teetered on the edge of falling again, and then one of the Death Spectres braced against his leg, adding just enough stability for him to complete the motion. He stood, and standing felt like victory, even though it was just the first step in a much longer process. "Can you walk?" Chaplain Amosis asked. Hecaton tested his leg, feeling the temporary repairs straining under his weight. "After a fashion." "Good enough. Stay close. We are leaving." The Death Spectres began their fighting withdrawal, moving in coordinated teams, each squad covering the others as they fell back toward where the Thunderhawk still hovered. Demons came at them from all directions now. The demon world throwing everything it had at these interlopers who dared to extract its prize. The Death Spectres met them with disciplined violence, their bolt guns speaking the Emperor's judgment, their faith forming an invisible barrier that the demons found difficult to cross. Hecaton limped after them, each step a struggle, his leg threatening to give out with every impact. The temporary repairs were failing already. He could feel them degrading in real time, but they lasted just long enough. He reached the Thunderhawk's position, felt heavy cables attached to hard points on his chassis, and then he was being lifted, hauled up into the transport's cargo bay by winches designed to handle exactly this kind of extraction. The Death Spectres followed, the last squads engaging in a fighting retreat as they backed up the loading ramp, their bolt rounds keeping the demons at bay until the very last moment. Chaplain Amosis was the last aboard, his Crozius swinging in wide arcs, crackling energy, keeping the manifestations back, and then the ramp was closing, and the Thunderhawk was accelerating, engines screaming as it fought to escape the demon world's gravity well. The demon world did not release them easily. It reached up with tendrils of warp energy, trying to drag the transport back down, trying to prevent this escape. The pilot, whoever they were, was good enough to avoid most of them, twisting the Thunderhawk through impossible maneuvers, pushing the machine to limits that would have reduced a lesser pilot to a smear on the control console. Alarms wailed throughout the compartment. Systems reported damage and overstress. But the Thunderhawk held together, and slowly, agonizingly, they climbed higher and higher, fighting for every meter of altitude. And then they were clear, breaking atmosphere, the demon world falling away behind them, its malevolent presence receding as they put distance between themselves and its corrupted surface. Hecaton lay in the cargo bay, secured by chains that were significantly more sophisticated than the Ork variety, his systems reporting multiple failures and damage across every category. But he was alive. He was free of the demon world. And the Death Spectres had, for reasons he did not yet understand, risked their lives to extract him. Chaplain Amosis approached, removing his skull-faced helm to reveal a weathered face marked by scars and what might have been paint, or might have been ritual scarification. "Rest, brother ancient. We will speak later, once you are stable. For now, know that your service continues. The Emperor still has work for you." Hecaton wanted to ask questions. He wanted to know how they had found him, why they had come, what the Death Spectres wanted with a damaged Minotaur's Dreadnought. But his systems were finally succumbing to the accumulated damage, consciousness fading as backup power reserves depleted and emergency shutdown protocols engaged to preserve his remaining biological functions. The last thing he was aware of, before darkness claimed him again, was the chaplain's words echoing in his mind. "Your service continues." After 382 years of dormancy, after a battle he thought would be his last, after facing corruption and defeat and the very real possibility of damnation, he had been given something unexpected. He had been given a second chance. The journey back to Death Spectres territory took several weeks, though Hecaton was not conscious for most of it. The Tech Marines worked on him continuously, stabilizing systems that were on the verge of complete failure, purging corruption that had managed to seep through cracks in his armor, performing the kind of intensive maintenance that should have been done centuries ago. They were skilled, these Death Spectres Tech Marines, perhaps more skilled than even the Minotaur's own artificers, and they approached their work with a reverence that Hecaton had not experienced since his first interment. When he finally returned to full consciousness, he found himself in a chapel workshop, a space that served as both place of worship and place of repair. Purity seals covered his armor, fresh ones overlaying the old, their prayers and wards forming a new layer of spiritual protection over the physical armor. Incense burned in braziers around the chamber, the smoke carrying prayers to the Emperor, and Chaplain Amosis stood nearby, waiting patiently for awareness to return. "Welcome back, brother ancient," the chaplain said when Hecaton's optical sensors focused on him. "You have been dormant for 6 weeks. Your repairs are complete as we can make them without access to Forge World facilities. You are functional, which is better than could have been hoped given your condition when we found you." Hecaton tested his systems and found the chaplain's assessment accurate. He was functional, not perfect. There was permanent damage that no amount of repair could fully address, but functional enough to walk, to fight, to serve. His weapons had been replenished, his ammunition stores refilled, his power cells charged. He felt, if such a word could apply to a dreadnought, almost refreshed. "How did you find me?" Hecaton asked, his vocabulator working properly now that skilled hands had restored its systems. "The dead told us," Chaplain Amosis replied, and when Hecaton's silence suggested confusion, he continued. "The Death Spectres commune with spirits of fallen warriors. It is our gift and our burden. We heard the cry of a warrior trapped on a demon world, a consciousness calling out in the darkness, refusing to surrender to corruption. We traced that call across the void and found you. It was not easy, and it was not quick, but we found you nonetheless." "Why?" "The Minotaurs and the Death Spectres have no alliance, no obligation to each other. We have an obligation to all loyal servants of the Emperor who resist the darkness. You endured 382 years on that demon world without falling to corruption. That deserves recognition. That deserves rescue. More than that, the dead spoke of your service. of battles fought and won, of duty maintained across centuries. A warrior like that should not be left to rot on a world claimed by chaos. Hecaton processed this, turning over the implications in his mind. The Death Spectres had risked a strike team, had committed significant resources, had braved a demon world, all to extract a Dreadnought from a chapter they had no formal ties to. It was, by any measure, an act of significant sacrifice, and it raised questions about what they expected in return. "What happens now?" he asked. "That depends on you," Amosis replied. "We can attempt to return you to your chapter, though the Minotaurs are notoriously difficult to contact and may not acknowledge your survival after so long. We can offer you a place among the Death Spectres, should you choose to accept it, though you would maintain your identity as a Minotaur's warrior. Or we can simply repair you and send you where you wish to go, trusting that the Emperor will guide your path." It was, Hecaton realized, a choice. Perhaps the first real choice he had been offered since his interment. The Minotaurs had never given him choices. They had given him orders, objectives, targets to destroy. But here, now, in this chapel workshop light years from his chapter, he was being offered agency in a way he had not experienced in centuries. He thought about returning to the Minotaurs, about resuming his place in the deep halls, about waking periodically to fight battles chosen by Chapter Master Moloch and the High Lords of Terror. He thought about the cold indifference with which his chapter treated their dreadnoughts, about being addressed as Hecaton rather than by his name, about being a weapon rather than a brother. After 382 years of isolation on that demon world, after facing his mortality and his limitations, and the very real prospect of corruption, the thought of returning to that existence felt hollow. But he also thought about the Death Spectre's offer, about serving with warriors who had risked everything to save him, about being treated not as a weapon, but as an honored ancient. There was appeal in that, certainly. But there was also the knowledge that he was not a Death Spectre, that his conditioning and his identity were bound up in being a Minotaur's warrior, and changing that felt like a betrayal of everything he had been. "I need time," he said finally, "to think, to consider my options. 382 years of dormancy gave me too much time to think, and now I find myself uncertain in ways that a Minotaur's warrior should not be uncertain." Chaplain Amosis nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "Take what time you need. You have earned it. When you are ready, we will speak again, and you can tell us what you have decided. Until then, you are welcome here. Our fortress monastery has halls for honored ancients. You may wait there in comfort, or you may join our brothers in training and preparation. The choice, as I said, is yours." And so Hecaton waited, not in stasis, but in active consciousness, walking the halls of the Death Spectre's fortress monastery, observing their training rituals, listening to their chaplains commune with the spirits of the fallen. He spoke with their warriors, answered questions about battles centuries past, offered tactical advice drawn from his extensive experience. He was, for perhaps the first time since his interment, treated not as a weapon or a relic, but as a person who happened to be encased in a walking war machine. It was different. It was strange. It was, in a way he could not quite articulate, exactly what he needed. Weeks passed, then months. Hecaton still had not made his decision about his future, and the Death Spectres did not press him. They were patient, these mysterious warriors, content to let him find his own path in his own time. And slowly, gradually, Hecaton began to understand something that had eluded him during his centuries of service to the Minotaurs. He understood that being a weapon was not the same as being a warrior. A weapon has no choice, no agency, no purpose beyond what is assigned to it by the hand that wields it. A warrior, even one encased in a dreadnought, even one whose body has been reduced to withered flesh floating in amniotic fluid, still possesses something that weapons do not. Warriors possess will. They possess the ability to choose their battles, to determine their own purpose, to define their service on their own terms. The Minotaurs had made him a weapon. The Death Spectres were offering him the chance to be a warrior again. Meanwhile, on the demon world he had left behind, the Orks had returned. Gragmek Skull Stomper was not the type of war boss to let good loot slip through. His fingers, just because the first attempt to claim it had gone poorly. He had gathered more boys, recruited more mechs, acquired bigger guns, and launched a second expedition to the cursed valley where the Dreadnought had fallen. Except when they arrived, the Dreadnought was gone. Only the chains remained, cut cleanly by what looked like powered weapons, and the churned ground where something large and heavy had been moved. Gragmek stared at the empty space for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and finally, something approaching respect. "Well," he said eventually, "that's annoying, but also kinda impressive. Debiki got rescued. Good for him." He turned to his assembled warband. "Right then. If we can't loot the Dready Noggy, we'll loot something else. I saw some interesting looking demon things on the way here. Let's go see if Day's got any good bits." And with that very orcish logic, Gragmek led his warband deeper into the demon world, looking for other things to loot, other fights to fight, other adventures to have. The loss of the Dreadnought was disappointing, certainly, but the galaxy was vast and full of interesting things to steal. There would be other opportunities. There always were, for Orks willing to go looking for them. The demons of the demon world watched them go with what might have been amusement, insofar as demons felt such things. The Orks were entertaining, in their own crude way. They would provide sport for a while, before the world inevitably claimed them, or they managed to fight their way off planet. Either outcome was acceptable. The demon world had eternity. It could afford to be patient. And deep in the Imperium, in a fortress monastery that orbited a dead world on the edge of known space, Hecaton Timon made his decision. He called Chaplain Amosis to the hall where he had been residing, and when the chaplain arrived, Hecaton spoke words he had never thought he would say. "I wish to serve alongside the Death Spectres, for as long as my systems remain functional and my service has value. I will maintain my identity as a warrior of the Minotaurs, my bronze armor, and my chapter's heraldry, but my loyalty will be to those who saw value in rescuing me. The Minotaurs wrote me off as lost centuries ago. You gave me a second chance. That deserves acknowledgement." Chaplain Amosis bowed his head in respect. "Your service honors us, brother ancient Hecaton Timon. Not Hecaton the enslaved giant, but Timon, the warrior who endured the unendurable. Welcome to the Death Spectres. May your weapons speak judgment, and your faith remain unshaken." And so began a new chapter in Hecaton's existence, one where he fought alongside warriors who valued him, where his counsel was sought and respected, where he was brother as much as weapon. The Death Spectres deployed him carefully, understanding that his systems, despite the repairs, would never be what they once were. But when they did deploy him, he fought, with a ferocity and determination that surprised even himself, because now he was fighting not just because orders demanded it, but because he chose to. The Minotaurs never knew of his survival, or if they did, they never acknowledged it. Chapter Master Moloch's records listed Brother Captain Hecaton Timon, later designated Hecaton Unit 77, as destroyed during operations in the Hadex anomaly. Gene seed irretrievable, service concluded. It was a footnote in the chapter's extensive history, one name among thousands who had given their lives in service to the Emperor and the High Lords of Terror. But Hecaton was not dead. He walked the battlefields of the Imperium's frontier, his bronze armor now decorated with the black and white of the Death Spectres alongside his original heraldry. He fought Chaos cultists on forgotten worlds, purged Xenos raiders from Imperial space, stood guard over locations the Death Spectres deemed sacred, and he did it all with the knowledge that he had earned his continued existence, that he had resisted corruption when corruption should have claimed him, that he had endured when endurance seemed impossible. The Orks, meanwhile, had their own story to tell about the time they found a Space Marine Dreadnought on a demon world and almost looted it before it woke up and started crumping everything in sight, and then got rescued by different Space Marines right when they had it chained up and ready to go. The story grew in the telling, as orc stories always do, until it became legend among certain clans. Some said the Dreadnought had been bigger than a stomper. Others claimed it had guns that could shoot through planets. A few insisted they had actually managed to loot it and had used it to conquer an entire sector before it exploded because Grisnak had pushed the wrong button. None of the stories were accurate, but all of them were, in their way, true enough for orcs, who cared less about factual accuracy and more about whether the story was good and made you want to go looking for your own Dreadnought to loot. Gragmek himself told the story differently each time, adjusting details for dramatic effect, but the core remained the same. Yeah, we found this huge beaky robot thingy on a demon world, right? And it woke up and started crumping us good and proper. Fought like a proper mad git, that one did. Respected it, I did. Then some other beakies came and nicked it while we was busy fighting demons. Disappointing, but also kinda impressive. Makes you think, don't it? About what else might be out there, waiting to be found and looted. And that, in the end, was perhaps the most important lesson of the entire affair. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, strange things happen. Warriors thought lost are found. Enemies thought defeated return. Corruption that seems inevitable is resisted. And sometimes, just sometimes, a consciousness trapped in a walking tomb for centuries finds not just continued existence, but actual purpose, actual meaning, actual choice about how to spend whatever time remains. The galaxy is vast. It contains multitudes. And among those multitudes are stories like this one, small in the grand scheme of things, but significant to those who lived them. Stories of endurance and resistance and the stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender seems like the only rational option. Stories of warriors who find new purpose after their old purpose has been exhausted. Stories of the strange and unexpected intersections that occur when orcs, space marines, and chaos all collide on a world where reality itself has given up trying to make sense. Hecaton Timon walks the Imperium's frontier still, as of the last reports that reached civilized space. He fights in the Emperor's name, though perhaps now he understands that service to the Emperor can take many forms. That duty does not have to mean blind obedience, that faith can coexist with choice. His systems degrade slowly, entropy taking its inevitable toll, but he maintains them as best he can with the help of the Death Spectre's tech marines. Someday, those systems will fail completely. Someday, consciousness will fade for the last time, and the warrior within the machine will finally earn his rest. But until that day comes, until the last power cell is exhausted and the last servo motor ceases, Hecaton will continue his service, not because he was ordered to, but because he chooses to. And that choice, that simple assertion of will in a universe that often seems to deny such things are possible, makes all the difference. The orcs continue their endless quest for loot and fights, because that is what orcs do. The demon world continues its existence on the edge of reality, corrupting and twisting and claiming whatever unfortunate souls stumble onto its surface. The Minotaurs continue their brutal service to the High Lords of Terror, their dreadnoughts treated with the same cold indifference, knowing nothing of one of their number who survived and found a different path. The Death Spectres walk their mysterious way, communing with the dead and rescuing the lost, guided by visions and prophecies that they alone can interpret. And somewhere in the vastness of the galaxy, on a ship traveling between stars, in a chapel workshop that serves as both sanctuary and armory, a consciousness that has endured for over 700 years reflects on the strange path that led from the battlefields of Kefren Prime to a demon world and finally to this moment. Hecaton Timon, once of the Minotaurs, now of the Death Spectres, warrior and weapon, and something more than either, stands watch over his brothers as they prepare for whatever battles the future holds. He has learned, in his centuries of existence, that the future is unknowable, that plans fail, and circumstances change, and the universe delights in surprising those who think they understand its patterns. But he has also learned that some things endure. Faith endures. Duty endures. The bonds between warriors who have bled together endure. And choice, that most precious and dangerous of all human capabilities, endures even in a consciousness that has been reduced to its barest essentials and bound to a machine. The story of what happens when Orks find a Minotaur's Dreadnought on a Chaos world is not, ultimately, about the Orks or the Dreadnought or even the Chaos world. It is about survival. It is about resistance. It is about the stubborn refusal to accept fate as inevitable, about the determination to find meaning and purpose even in circumstances that seem designed to strip both away. It is about what it means to be a warrior in the truest sense, not just someone who fights, but someone who chooses to fight, who decides what they fight for, who maintains their humanity even when their humanity has been reduced to a consciousness floating in fluid inside an armored tomb. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But within that war, within that endless grinding conflict that spans galaxies and millennia, there are moments of grace, moments of unexpected mercy, moments where warriors thought lost are found, where consciousness on the verge of corruption is pulled back from the brink, where choices are offered to those who thought all choices had been taken from them. This was one of those moments. And while it may not change the fate of the galaxy, while it may not shift the balance in the eternal struggle between order and chaos, while it may not be recorded in the great histories that are maintained on Terra, it mattered. It mattered to Hecaton Timon, whose existence was given new purpose. It mattered to the Death Spectres, who added another warrior to their ranks and proved that their visions and prophecies could lead to successful rescue. It even mattered, in a strange way, to the Orks, who got a good fight out of it, and a story that would be told around campfires and in warbands for years to come. And sometimes, in the grim darkness of the far future, that is enough. To matter to someone, to have your existence acknowledged as valuable, to be given the opportunity to choose your own path, even when that path leads inevitably toward the same end that awaits all things in a universe governed by entropy and violence. The destination may be the same, but the journey and the choices made along that journey, those are what define a warrior. Those are what separate mere weapons from actual heroes. Hecaton Timon is a hero, though he would never describe himself that way. He is simply a warrior who did his duty, who resisted when resistance seemed futile, who endured when endurance seemed impossible, and who chose, when given the opportunity, to continue his service on his own terms, rather than returning to an existence that had never truly valued him. In a galaxy full of mindless violence and pointless suffering, that simple act of choice is perhaps the most defiant thing any being can do. And so we end where we began, in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war. But now we know that within that war, within that darkness, there are still points of light, still moments of grace, still warriors who choose to stand against the dying of the light, not because they must, but because they will. And as long as such warriors exist, as long as consciousness can choose defiance over surrender, there remains hope, however small, however fragile, that the future might yet be better than the past. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what happens when Orks discover a Minotaur's Dreadnought on a Chaos world, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and lets me know you want more explorations of Warhammer 40k lore and stories. Share this with your friends who love 40k. Leave a comment about what topics you'd like to see covered next. And remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But within that war, there are always stories worth telling. Thank you for watching, and the Emperor protects.